Lunch this morning. We had 55 college students in my college class this morning, so we basically alternated on 1 and 3 as to when to breathe in there. And we've got more college students visiting with us tonight. And I'm a very soft sell person. I never try to put any pressure on anyone to identify with us, but obviously for any of you who've been visiting with us, if you would like to be a part of our church family here while you're here going to school, then we want you to know you're certainly invited. And just let me know, and I'd be glad to introduce you to one of the shepherds of the congregation. And they usually take you back to that room back there. They just lash you for about 5 minutes. It's really over pretty quickly, and but they'd be glad to talk with you, and if you were interested in being with us. Also, among our visitors tonight, we have a brother all the way from South Africa. Brother Ashley Guston is with us tonight. He's sitting back there in the back. He spoke at Riverview, he said, this morning. And we are Facebook friends, but I don't know if we'd ever met in person until tonight. And Brother Ashley also has lost his wife, and he's one of many people around the world that have gone out of their way to encourage me and to lift me up. And so it's great to be able to thank him in person for that, and to wish him the very best in the Lord's work. Also, I meant to tell you all something that happened when my niece Darby was in town. I told it to the college kids today, but I meant to tell you this story. 2 weeks ago tomorrow, Darby turned 8 years old. So the family planned a big trip to head over to Disney, and Darby and her family were there all week, but all of us went over on that Monday, the day that she turned 8, to hang out at Epcot. So that night, I was driving my sister-in-law, Kelly, and her husband, Ryan, and Darby to their resort, and on the way, we passed a sign that said Blizzard Beach. And I asked Kelly, my sister-in-law, is that some kind of water park? And Darby speaks up from the back seat and says, Blizzard Beach is the only fully animatronic water park at Disney. On the day she turned 8 years old. So I started laughing, said, what did you say? And she repeated it word for word, animatronic. I learned that word when she said it. Actually, I looked it up right there. So then later that night, I was getting ready to pull into where they were staying, and I was complaining that, boy, these resort rooms, they are so overpriced. There's nothing to them at all, and yet you have to pay a lot for them. And then once again, Darby speaks up and says, but they still have that Disney touch. So I thought, what is going on here? But her dad explained that she's been so excited about the trip. She's been watching these YouTube videos about Disney over and over again. So she's just filled with propaganda now from Disney and can repeat it verbatim. And I felt like if I'm going to tell this story, I have to tie it into the lesson. So it just shows you how people could hear the oral presentations of Jesus and pass them down accurately, because Darby has mastered the ability to hear and then just pass on exactly what she has heard. So anyway, we had a lot of fun when that little goofball was in town with her family. Well, this morning, I talked with you about the reliability of the Gospels. And again, the point of the lesson this morning was not to say, now, if you want to consider Christianity, you have to accept the Gospels as the inspired, inerrant Word of God. I believe that that's what they are. But for someone who has doubts or someone new to the claims of Christianity, that's not really what we need to ask them to consider. All we need to ask them to consider is, do the Gospels give us enough reliable information about Jesus that we are in a position to make a decision about him? And for the reasons I outlined this morning, I think we do have that kind of information. But really, all of that then leads us to the ultimate question of, was Jesus who he claimed to be? And as I said to you this morning, unique among all world religions, Christianity itself puts itself on the line with a test of history. It makes a historical claim. And that claim is that Jesus of Nazareth came as God in the flesh. He died on the cross by crucifixion. He was buried. And 3 days later, his followers said the tomb was empty, and they saw him. And that Jesus is, in fact, vindicated as the Son of God. Now that's a historical claim. Islam does not make any claims like that. Hinduism does not make any claims. Buddhism does not make any claims like that. Christianity is unique in offering that test for the world to consider as to whether what Jesus said about himself is true. And so tonight what I want to do is put that test to the test by looking at some pieces of information. You might think of them as puzzle pieces that have to be put together somehow. So what I want to do tonight is talk with you about some puzzles of the resurrection, puzzling pieces of information that we're going to have to ask ourselves, what is the best way to account for all of these puzzle pieces? Now, before I present the ones that I have in mind, I want to clear away two facts that are not puzzles. They are not in dispute. And the first of those facts is that historians agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified and that his disciples later claimed that he rose from the dead. This is really not in dispute by not just Christians, not just religious people, but by historians. This is really not in dispute. One of the reasons, of course, is because of the reliability of the gospel testimony itself to these facts. Another reason is because there are sources outside of the New Testament that corroborate this same information. For example, a historian named Tacitus, writing about the great fire that took place in Rome during the time of Nero and his efforts to avert blame, says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the population. He uses the Latin spelling Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Pontius Pilate. In fact, even Bart Ehrman, who is certainly someone who is a critic of Christianity, is willing to say the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life. And among the reasons he says this is not only the reliability of the gospel testimony itself, not only the outside historical corroboration, but even from archaeology. Here was a discovery made in 1968 of the remains of someone who had been executed by crucifixion. And I'm not going to take the time to read all of the description here, but suffice it to say that the details that were ascertained by looking at the remains of this victim of crucifixion are very much in line with how the Gospels describe crucifixion took place. And so because of the testimony of the Gospels, the testimony of history and archaeology, even a critic of Christianity like Bart Ehrman is willing to say, well, here's one thing nobody really questions. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. Here is another puzzle that's not a puzzle, something that nobody here is disputing tonight. Nobody here believes dead people return to life naturally. Now, I actually have friends who are not believers who essentially think that's exactly what we believe. Well, you guys just think this guy was executed and then presto, he just popped right back to life. Well, that's not what anybody believes. Nobody believes that people who have died naturally come to life. The issue is, though, is it possible that there are forces at work beyond nature? And of course, the whole point of the last couple of weeks' lessons is there is strong reason to believe that there is something outside of the natural world. In fact, there is a source and ground of existence that by logic cannot be a part of nature, but in fact is the one God that Jews, Muslims, and Christians all believe in as the source of existence. And what the claim is that God, the one by whom we live and move and have our being, the one who by every moment sustains life into existence, could possibly act in such a way to depart from the normal course of the way he acts and raise someone from the dead. So nobody here is trying to argue that just by some natural means, Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. The claim is that there is evidence to think, though, that the God we have talked about in the last couple of weeks acted in a profound and extraordinary way. Well, what is that evidence? Well, here are the puzzle pieces I want you to consider with me tonight. Here's puzzle number one. Where did the story of the resurrection come from? Now, why is that a puzzle? Well, let me ask you to turn to John chapter 11, and I'll explain why I say this is a puzzle. We know that among the Jews of the first century, there were different schools of thought. By the way, do you know what the primary piece of evidence is that all historians study to learn about different schools of thoughts among the Jews? The New Testament. It's what all historians study to learn about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We know that there was a difference of opinion among the Jews, but we do know that the most common belief reflected by the Pharisees was that at the end of time, God would raise the dead. You can see this reflected here in John chapter 11 in the story of the raising of Lazarus. When Jesus arrives in Bethany and he talks to Lazarus' sister, whose name is Martha. And she says to him in John 11, verse 21, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And in verse 23, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. Listen, verse 24, Martha said to him, I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. So we know that some Jews believed there would be a resurrection of the dead at the end of time. But until the coming of Jesus, there is no evidence anywhere that any Jews ever believed that the Messiah would come and die and be raised from the dead in the middle of history. That idea among Jews is totally unprecedented until the time of the New Testament. Well, maybe such a story could come from the pagans. No, not really. Do you remember when Paul went to Athens and he spoke before the philosophers in Acts 17, that they are willing to listen to him while he talks about the God that they don't know, the God who has revealed himself in creation. But do you remember at what point they stop listening to him? It's as soon as he raises the issue of the resurrection of Jesus, and at that point they stop. You know why? Because for the pagans, the notion of death was a release and escape from the body, and the idea that somehow one day your spirit would be reunited with your body was preposterous to them. In fact, do you remember when Paul defends himself before Festus, the Roman governor? As soon as Paul brings up the resurrection of Jesus, Festus says, you are out of your mind. So here's the simple point I want you to consider. Where did the idea that the Messiah would come and die and be raised in the middle of history, where did that idea come from if it did not come from Jewish tradition and did it not come from pagan tradition? All right, that's one puzzle. Here is a second puzzle. How is it possible that the story of the resurrection would rise? That was an unintended pun, by the way. I just saw it. Sometimes you can't help yourself. How did the story of the resurrection rise so soon? How did it rise so quickly? What do I mean by this? Well, this morning I talked with you about the reliability of the Gospels, and I granted to you that it's likely that the Gospels were written 30 to 50 years after the time of Jesus, but they were in the living memory of Jesus, and they contain eyewitness testimony. However, there is another line of evidence that we have even earlier than all of the Gospels, and Luke read it for us tonight. Would you turn back with me to 1 Corinthians 15? Incidentally, as you turn there, Dean texted me this afternoon and said, what's the scripture reading for Luke for tonight? And I said 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. And then I got a text a few minutes later, Luke disagrees with where you've ended the reading. And I thought, what? Smart like a little kid. I want to take care of you when I get here. Well, guess what? He was right. It was supposed to go through verse 5. So from now on, Luke, can you just preview my sermons and make sure everything's okay here? I obviously need the help. All right, I want you to think about this statement here in 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3. Paul says, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. So you see the words deliver and receive. Those are technical terms for handing down a tradition. It's the same terminology the rabbis used when they talked about handing down a tradition. Paul says, when I came to preach there, I handed down to you what I also received. And then here's what he says he received. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then here's verse 5, Luke, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. For many reasons, scholars of all stripes, Christian, non-Christian, believe that this statement here is a very early statement that Paul had come upon that he passed along to the Corinthians. Why do they believe this? Well, first of all, if you just look at it, it has all the hallmarks of some kind of formal statement that's been designed to easily remember because of its parallels. Do you see, for example, the most obvious is repetition of the phrase in accordance with the Scriptures. Not only that, you have this similar construction that Christ died, he was raised, and then a modifying phrase, for our sins and on the third day. So this sounds like something that was written almost like what we would think of as a poem or song, but written as an easily memorized statement that could be passed down. Now, think about the chronology here, and I'm going to try to use the stage as a visual aid. And I want you to picture that the far end of the stage is the year of Jesus' crucifixion, right? Which is either the year 30 or 33. Now, Paul is writing to the Corinthians here. The book of 1 Corinthians, we kind of know about when it was written. How do we know? Well, Acts 18 tells us that when Paul first went to Corinth, there was a governor named Gallio. And the Romans, fortunately, kept really good records. And we know when he was governor, the year 51. So, Paul here is writing to the Corinthians, and he says, hey, you remember when I came to you at Corinth? So he's a few years later. Most people think right now is probably about the year 55. And he says, hey, you remember when I came to you? 51. And here's what I delivered to you. It's what I received. So if he is delivering what he received, he got it earlier than that, right? So do you see how we keep being pushed closer and closer to the actual date of the crucifixion? Not only that, the most likely time Paul would have received this is when the book of Acts describes him meeting with the apostles. Also the book of Galatians, meeting the apostles in the very first few years of his conversion. Furthermore, a lot of people who study this kind of thing say there seems to be evidence that this came from a source from Jerusalem. For example, it uses what name for Peter? His traditional Aramaic name, Cephas. And in fact, if you look at this text, there are all sorts of terms that are found nowhere else in Paul's writings that indicate this wasn't original with him, it was passed on. The phrase, according to the Scriptures, is found nowhere else in his writings. The word appeared is found only one other time in all of his writings. The phrase, on the third day, is found nowhere else. And then his description of the apostles as the 12. The point is, those who study such things say that this statement that Paul says, hey, when I came to you, I passed on what I got, is a statement that dates within the very first 2 or 3 years of the crucifixion itself. Which means we're not talking about a gospel written at the end of the century or even the middle of the century. We are talking about a story that was passed on from within a couple of years of the events themselves. And so the question is, how did this story rise so quickly? Here's puzzle number 3. Why do the resurrection stories in the Gospels feature women as witnesses? It is women who are the first to discover that the tomb is empty, and it is women who are the first to see Jesus in his resurrection. Why do the Gospels feature women? Now you may think, well, why is this such a big deal? Here's the reason why. In the first century, there were a lot of sexist attitudes about women, not like there aren't here in the 21st century too, but there certainly were in the first century. And because of that sexism, women's testimony was not considered legitimate. in public hearings. For example, the Jewish historian Josephus says, "From women let no evidence be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their sex." And I would understand what an insult that was if I knew what temerity meant, but I don't. I'm going to look it up in a dictionary. But it sounds pretty bad. And what he's saying is, we don't take women's testimony as acceptable. Now, if that is the case, why would it be that the Gospels, when they talk about the resurrection of Jesus, emphasize that it is women who are the primary witnesses? In fact, look in Luke chapter 24. Have you ever noticed how the apostles themselves react to the testimony of the women? In Luke chapter 24, after the women encounter the angels who tell them about the resurrection, it says in verse 10, Luke 24:10, "Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles, but," verse 11, "these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them." Now, it's certainly not just in this case the apostles don't believe. There's a lot of other examples we have. But certainly in this case, they don't believe the report that the women are giving, even though they were eyewitnesses. So here's the thing I want you to consider. Why would it be that the Gospels make such a point that people whose testimony ordinarily was not taken seriously were the first ones to see the empty tomb and also to see the risen Jesus? Here's puzzle number 4. How could the apostles have claimed that Jesus' tomb was empty in the very city where he was buried? Now, in full disclosure, you should know that some people who do not believe in the resurrection deny that Jesus was buried. They believe that the Jews would not have taken time to bury someone who went through such a disgraceful death, and the most likely his body was cast into a mass grave. But that simply is not what the evidence shows us. In fact, Josephus talks about the very process by which the Jews would ensure burial, even of someone crucified. The Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those who were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. And you may recall there's a lot of urgency in the gospel testimony to do exactly that with the corpse of Jesus. So then, how could the apostles have claimed that Jesus' tomb was empty in the very city where he was buried? Let me show you what I'm talking about. Would you look over with me in Acts 2 at Peter's sermon on Pentecost in Jerusalem just a few weeks after Jesus was executed? In Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 says this, verse 29. "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day." In fact, it is with us to this day. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, you can go to the sepulcher of David. Now, here's what Peter is saying. We know that David died and was buried. His tomb is still here. If we wanted to, we could go open it up and see whatever's left inside of it. Verse 30, "Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up." So think with me through the logic here. Peter says, here is a promise made in the Old Testament. And he says, it cannot have applied to David. Why doesn't it apply to David? Because his body has corrupted and is in the tomb. And therefore it does apply to Jesus. But the only way logically that argument makes sense is if what is the case about Jesus' tomb? It no longer has a corpse in it, like David's tomb does. And that's why he can say these promises apply to Jesus, but they don't apply to David. Here's the thing, though, I want you to see. This is not like one of those, some farmer out in the middle of a wheat field in Nebraska who says he saw Elvis. This is a claim being made right in the very place within weeks of the alleged event. If it was not the case that the tomb was empty, what would have been the way to disprove it? If you're one of the Jews hearing Peter make this claim, how would you have disproved him? We would have walked a few minutes to the tomb, rolled the stone away, and showed whatever was left of the corpse of Jesus by this point in time. But nobody ever does that. And yet the apostles are willing to make this claim right where the events took place. And again, I can't stress this point enough as to how different Christianity is on this point. For instance, over the years I've been very interested in studying about Islam. In the Quran, there is not a single miracle recorded of Muhammad. There are no claims to test Islam by on the basis of the Quran. Later Muslim tradition did add miracles, and in fact a lot of scholars think they were added in later tradition precisely to counter the Christian objection, why didn't Muhammad do any miracles like Jesus did? The point I want you to see is that Christianity is unique in staking a claim on history and doing so right at the very place where these events occurred. Here's a fifth puzzle. Why do the Gospels describe the resurrected Jesus in such a strange way? What do I mean by strange? Well, look with me over in John chapter 20 at one of these stories of the appearances. There's something very unusual in the appearances of Jesus. First of all, when Jesus appears, there is something about him that is very different from what he used to be. You'll notice, for example, that John 20 and verse 19 says, on the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked, where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, presumably locked from the inside, because it doesn't work well to lock from the outside. Have you all ever done that? Twice now already at my house. I've woken up, got ready to go somewhere, I can't find my keys, and I look and they're out in the front door. So fortunately, apparently I guess I shouldn't. Can we erase this part of the sermon right here? But fortunately, my neighborhood is pretty safe. So yeah, they're locked from the inside. And yet it says, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. So on the one hand, there's something about this resurrection appearance where obviously the normal laws of physics are not at work. And yet, in the very next verse, Jesus can show them his hands and his side. There's just this strange continuity and discontinuity about the body of Jesus, almost as if it is a body that was, on the one hand, a body that was in this life, but on the other hand, a body transformed for another kind of existence altogether. And here's the other thing that is really strange. Have you ever thought about the fact that in the Gospels, in the story of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, there are descriptions of someone who is dazzling, but it is not Jesus. It's the angels who appeared to the women, are said to be in dazzling apparel. Now, the reason I want you to consider that is, in the one passage in the Old Testament where a resurrection is described by appearance, and again, it's a resurrection at the end of time, not of the Messiah in the middle of history, but the one passage where there is such a description, it's in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 3, and it says, when the righteous are raised, they will shine like the sky. So if you were going to make up a story, that would really be the only raw data from which to bring to invent a story, and yet that is precisely not how Jesus is described. He's described, the only way I can say it is strange, just a remarkable situation in which on the one hand there's continuity with this life, but on the other hand there's something that's far transformed and beyond this life. That's a puzzle. How would we explain this puzzle? And then here's the sixth puzzle. Why were the apostles so willing to suffer for a story they created? When I say they created, I just simply mean they're the ones who are preaching it. They're the ones who are teaching it. Do you remember the account in Acts chapter 5? It's really the first persecution of Christians. The apostles have been preaching and doing miracles in the name of Jesus, which if Jesus is dead and gone doesn't make a lot of sense. So there is an implicit argument they're making that he's still alive, and it's through his power we're able to heal people. The Jewish sect that did not believe in the resurrection has a huge problem with this, the Sadducees. So they haul the apostles before the Sanhedrin Council, Peter and John, in Acts chapter 5. They lashed them, they beat them for preaching the resurrection. And it says in verse 41, they left the presence of the council rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. In fact, it is Peter and John in particular who were said to do this. The Peter and John who in the gospel accounts are the first two to run and actually look around in the tomb where Jesus had been buried. What I'm asking you to consider is, why were they so willing to suffer for a story they created if it wasn't true? Now I recognize somebody say, well, wait a minute. There are people all through history who have given their lives for something that was false. And that is exactly right. The Islamic radicals, who we just thought about a couple of months ago on the anniversary of 9/11, they gave their lives for a cause that we believe is absolutely untrue. I recognize that people will give their lives for what is false. That's not the question I'm raising here, though. The question I'm raising is, why would these men willingly give their lives for what they know is false? Because they know they made it up. That's a different kind of question altogether. So, here are 6 puzzle pieces of the resurrection. Really not any of these, so far as I know, are in serious dispute by historians. And what is left for us to decide is, how do we best account and explain these puzzle pieces? And you can't do like I told you one time I did when I was a kid and I tried to put puzzles together. I would take the scissors out and cut them and paste them till I could just make it fit. Or if it wouldn't fit, I'd just leave it out. Well, you can't do that here. Well, one option would be to say the apostles just made the story up of the resurrection. That's possible. We know there are frauds. There are plenty of religious frauds in our world today. But how does that square with these puzzle pieces? First of all, where would they have gotten such an idea, considering it was unprecedented in Judaism and unheard of in paganism, for the Messiah to come and die and be raised from the dead? Why would it have been the case if they were just making things up? They would have invented as their primary initial witnesses people whose testimony was not taken seriously. Why is it that they would have made such a claim in the very place where the resurrection was supposedly to have occurred when it would have been so easy to disprove? Why would they have chosen such a strange way to describe Jesus' appearance rather than draw upon the one passage we have to describe a resurrection? And why would they have been so willing to suffer for what they knew was false because they knew they made it up? It's a very hard case to make. Well, maybe the apostles were mistaken about what they saw. But if they were mistaken about the empty tomb, it would have been very easy to disprove the claim by opening the tomb and revealing the body of Jesus. And furthermore, if in fact the apostles were simply mistaken about this, why would they have claimed to have witnesses in the presence not only of their own appearances, but also women who actually have seen this? When the women have straightened them out in what they were mistaken about. What I want you to see is that if you understand the significance of each of these pieces of evidence, and you start to try to explain how to account for all of them, it is very difficult to escape the conclusion that the God who made heaven and earth and sustains life moment by moment in existence acted in a very unusual way. It's interesting to me, a few years ago, and it might have been Marty who pointed this book out to me. There's a book by a Jewish scholar his name is Pinchas Lapid, who's not a Christian, but who looked at historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And his conclusion is, in regard to the future resurrection of the dead, I am and remain a Pharisee. In other words, he believes in the resurrection at the end of time. Concerning the resurrection of Jesus, I was for decades a Sadducee. I am no longer a Sadducee. So then what are we to make of this? If the historical evidence is best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. 3 times in the Gospels, Jesus predicted that this is exactly what would happen. The passage you all know in Matthew 16, Jesus asks the apostles, "Who do people say that I am?" And they gave various answers. Then Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And then Jesus says, here's what's going to happen to me. I'm going to be delivered up, taken to Jerusalem, flogged, and put to death. And 3 days later, I will rise again. That is the historical claim that Jesus makes that will tell us whether or not the confession Peter made is true. And so we have to decide what we're going to do with this. Now, in the very first lesson in this series, I tried to strongly urge everyone here to understand that it is okay to have doubts, that I have had doubts. And I also tried to make sure we all understand that there are different reasons for doubt. Some of those doubts are intellectual. I believe people have legitimate intellectual doubts. I hope that the lessons I've done over the last few weeks have helped to address some of those. But I also believe people have emotional doubts, especially when we've seen someone we love suffer and die. There's a story that I think about a lot, that I've pondered a lot over the last year. It's a story in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. It's about a man who has watched his son suffer horrifically. And he's watched him suffer, and he's watched Jesus' apostles try to do something about it, and they have failed miserably. And Jesus says to him in verse 23 of Mark 9, "All things are possible for one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." I take that to mean this, that intellectually he believed in Jesus' power. He was just struggling here at the moment to imagine that anything could help his boy. And when I watched Christy take her last breath, as many of you have watched a loved one take the last breath, there is something that is so biological. And there is something that seems so final, that it's hard to imagine, even beyond what the intellect seems to reason us to, that isn't the final answer. But then I think about how final it must have seemed for Jesus' mother and for John to look at Jesus on the cross as he gave up his last breath. How final it must have seemed to see what his body looked like. How final it must have seemed to watch his body be prepared for burial and sealed in a tomb. And sometimes our heart struggles, but our mind tells us, here's the truth. It seemed like death was the final answer then. But we have really good reasons to believe it was not. And all I've tried to do today is show you that there's a really good case to be made for our mind has to pull along our heart when our heart lags behind. And so if you share the prayer that I pray a lot, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Be of courage. And know that what the evidence is telling us is that death is not final. That the resurrection tells us that Jesus has broken the power of death. And he promises us by the same power someday to raise us all to new life and enjoy life with him forever. And if we can help you in that tonight, to enjoy that life, let us know while we stand and sing together.